Good Shabbos, everybody. It's lovely to see. Love to see so many of you. Hear the singing. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. You know, over the past 2 months, we've heard, or I've heard, I can't say we've heard, I've heard, a lot of people who innocuously refer to what's going on in Europe as the Holocaust all over again, accusing Russia of Nazism, acting like the Nazis, and the Ukrainians calling the Russians Nazis. And of course, people just throw it out there. They throw it out, that term Nazi. They throw out the term Holocaust. I've got to tell you something, that a month after Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky spoke to Israel's Knesset from Kiev. You could have watched it on TV. They actually broadcast it. And in his speech, he made many comparisons with the Holocaust. He pointed out the founding of the Nazi Party and the invasion of Ukraine happened on the same date, February the 24th. He said the Russians were intent on destroying Ukrainian culture, destroying what makes Ukrainians Ukrainian. Zelensky reminded his audience of how the Nazis called what they were doing to the Jews the final solution, and said that Moscow had been calling what is happening in Ukraine a final solution. He said, and I quote, "Moscow says so. Without the war against us, they would not be able to ensure a final solution, allegedly for their own security, just like it was said 80 years ago." He pointed out how Russian missiles hit Babi Yar, a place outside of Kiev where 100,000 Holocaust victims were murdered and are buried. His comparison of what was happening in Ukraine to the Holocaust drew a largely negative response from Israeli lawmakers. So the question is why? What's happening in Ukraine is a war. It's a bloody, brutal war, and the Russians are guilty of war crimes. Intentionally targeting civilian populations in an attempt to terrorize them is a war crime. Now, legal experts are debating whether what's happening in Ukraine actually meets the internationally accepted definition of genocide, which refers to acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. For the Ukrainians, they still remember the Holodomor. The Holodomor is a Ukrainian word which means death by hunger. For those of you who know a little bit of history of the area will know that in the 1930s, the Soviet Union instituted land policies that led to a food shortage and famine, and millions of Ukrainians died. That feels like a form of genocide to them. And even if that was happening in Ukraine, is a genocide, it is not a Holocaust. This past week we marked Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. We are all too aware of how unique the Holocaust is in history of mankind and of the world. Never before have the efficiencies of the modern production line been applied to the purpose of murder with a goal of annihilating an entire race, the Jewish people. Megillat HaShoah, which is the scroll of the Holocaust, the Megillah of the Holocaust, which was published by the Rabbinical Assembly and the Shechter Institute in Israel, tells the story of the Shoah in the form of one of the Megillot, which has now been added to our other Megillot that we read during the year. It's similar to an updated book of the Book of Lamentations. It describes how Jews in exile suffered every time there was a resurgence of Jew hatred, and then describes what happened in Europe during the Shoah. And I'm going to just quote you one paragraph. What befell the people Israel in Nazi Europe, however, is beyond classification, and what confronted its sons and daughters defies description. Untold numbers were forced out of their homes, torn from their families, trampled in the dust, worked to death. 6 million, created in the divine image, were strangled, cremated, shot, buried alive, and died of starvation, of thirst, and of the cold. This time the monster stretched open its mouth beyond bounds, with a blood-curdling shriek and with a stinking breath, and sought to eradicate everything. War is always terrible. Innocent people are crippled and killed, lives destroyed. The infrastructure that is needed to support normal life is destroyed. And war often slips into genocide, where particular ethnic groups are targeted simply because of who they are. But not every war is a genocide, and not every genocide is a Holocaust. We have to be very sparing in how we use those terms. The closest thing to the Holocaust in modern history was the Rwandan genocide, when as many as 800,000 Tutsis were murdered by extremist Hutus who were aiming to entirely wipe out the Tutsis. At the time, the President of the United States was Bill Clinton. And since that time, he has repeatedly expressed regret for not doing more. Clinton told a journalist, "If we'd gone in sooner, I believe we could have saved at least a third of the lives that were lost." But you know what? Even Rwanda is an imperfect comparison to the Holocaust. And the reason why is that 3 years before the massacre in Rwanda, Tutsi rebels from Uganda set up camps in northern Rwanda with a goal of re-establishing their rule there. Before they were driven out, those people had been an elite group that treated Hutsis like slaves. Well, you know what? As far as I know, the Jews never treated any Germans as slaves. And they certainly didn't make any efforts to overthrow the German government. The term Nazi, unfortunately, is very overused. Because not every bad guy is a Nazi, and not everyone who is your enemy is a Nazi. The actual Nazis displayed an evil and inhumanity that is extraordinarily rare. Thank God. Everyone calls their enemy a Nazi. Zelensky compared the Russians to the Nazis. The Nazis wanted to destroy everything and everyone, and the Russians are saying the same thing about Zelensky and his people, that they are Nazis. But what's really ironic is that everyone has to use the Nazi card. Even Putin, who said Russia was invading Ukraine to end Nazi fascism, in the country. A country with a democratically elected Jewish president is not suffering from Nazi fascism, even if you don't like them. The comparisons are also used in Israel, in the Israel and Palestinian conflict. Palestinians compare the Israelis to Nazis. And in Palestinian areas in the past, there has been graffiti showing a Star of David equal to a swastika. And it doesn't help. The Israelis have also made comparisons to Nazis. Israel's ambassador to the UN recently likened Hamas and the Hamas Charter calling for Israel's destruction to the Nazis' goal of genocide. There are no death camps in Gaza or the West Bank, as far as I know anyway. Palestinians living under Israeli military authorities may face many types of harassment, but it's not genocide. In this week's Torah portion, Acharimot, we have a very curious story of the goat for the Azazel, the original scapegoat. The Torah tells us that the process of selecting the scapegoat was by lottery. The Torah explains, Aaron shall lay both his hands upon the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities and transgressions of the Israelites, I should say. Whatever their sins, putting them on the head of the goat is what he was required to do. And it then shall be sent off, the goat shall be sent off into the wilderness. The Jews have all too often been the world's goat for Azazel. Blamed for everything that's wrong and blamed for the sins of other peoples. Fortunately for us, however, until the Nazis came along, no one had the ability to really completely wipe us out. Hitler came pretty close. Who knows what would have happened if Hitler and Japan would have won the war? As we remember those who perished in the Holocaust, we remember that it was an exceptional time that was unique, not only in Jewish history, but also in world history. President Zelensky's attempt to link what is happening in Ukraine with the Holocaust failed, and it failed miserably. Israeli lawmakers didn't buy it, and neither do most Jews who have an ounce of intelligence. He's fortunate, Zelensky is very fortunate, that the attempt didn't backfire on him, because it could have done. The response in Israel has been that he was wrong to make that comparison. By trying to make that comparison, he really demeaned and belittled what the Holocaust is. But what's happening in Ukraine is terrible, and Ukraine deserves the support of the world as they fight off Russian aggression. Such attempts to make an equivalency with the Holocaust always fails, because no rational thinking person believes it when Israel, or Hamas for that matter, is compared to the Nazis. There is no comparison. It doesn't compare. So to throw it around shows A, how little the person who's using the term really understands, and how little they really believe that the other person they're speaking to understands. Everyone's suffering is unique, but no one should use Jewish suffering and the horrors of the Holocaust to advance their own causes, because nothing compares to what happened in Nazi Germany, and we certainly will never forget. Shabbat Shalom.